One of the biggest questions of the Five Nights at Freddy's timeline has always been the beginning, and a lot of debate is focused on the order of deaths at the beginning of this franchise, that being the crying child, Elizabeth Afton, Charlotte Emily, and the missing child incident. Besides talking about it in reference to Help Wanted 2, I haven't made a dedicated video on this topic in over a year, which is a big deal because my opinions have changed since then, especially with some new information we've gotten. Some of that new information being last week's video on how Balloon Boy might be part of Circus Baby's Pizza World, and by proxy, putting Circus Baby Pizza World's opening way earlier in the timeline than I originally thought. So what are my thoughts now? Well, without any further ado, let's get into it. Slices, put on your aprons, and let's bake ourselves a theory. Also, shout out to the new background I commissioned from BarBADroid, the same artist who does the thumbnails. I figured if I'm going to be using green screen while I'm in this basement, I might as well spruce up the place. Or get them to spruce up the place, because they're a great artist. We should start with some background info for each event of the timeline that we're talking about today, and we can start in order of most to least information we have. The first being the missing child incident, otherwise known as the MCI, the event where William Afton separately led 5 children into a back room using the Spring Bonnie's suit, and once they were back there, he killed them, stuffing each of them into a different animatronic. Thanks to the newspaper clippings in FNAF 1, we definitely know this happened at a Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and we know the restaurant was open for about a year or so after the fact, before eventually closing due to foul odor and general bad press. The bodies were never found, so that wasn't technically the direct cause of the closing of Freddy Fazbear's. This event is technically the easiest to place on a timeline. I've dismissed it in the past, but it is notable that every iteration of the missing child incident in the books takes place in 1985. Not to mention that one of those stories, Into the Pit, is being made into an actual video game into the continuity, and that story is the Fazbear Fright story that brought us that 1985 date again. And if the MCI does take place in 1985, that squarely places it before any FNAF game that we know about. At least any FNAF game with a solid date, because FNAF 4 gets weird since it's Nightmares, so that could take place pretty much anywhere on the timeline or over a long course of the timeline. It's hard to tell. Another fairly straightforward death placement would be Elizabeth Afton. We learn in Sister Location that Circus Baby's Pizza World was set to open with the Funtime animatronics, and Elizabeth Afton was incredibly curious about Circus Baby, the one that William said he made for her. However, soon before the place ever fully opened, she got alone with Circus Baby and the Funtime programming took over. Circus Baby scooped Elizabeth inside of herself, killing the girl in the process. So we know for a fact that Elizabeth Afton died when Circus Baby's Pizza World was set to open. But as helpful as that is, it doesn't technically tell us a lot. We know that it has to take place before Sister Location, but we don't technically know when Elizabeth Afton dies in relation to Sister Location. Circus Baby's Party and Rental opens after Circus Baby's Pizza World never opens, but that time gap could be anywhere from months to years to decades even. The only other references we get to Elizabeth Afton before Sister Location in this franchise is seemingly the empty bedroom in the FNAF 4 minigames. Now, some people use this as evidence that Elizabeth Afton is dead, but technically that's not confirmation. All that it means is Elizabeth isn't here at the time, so that could be interpreted as Elizabeth being dead, or, I don't know, she got taken in the divorce. It's really up to interpretation. It's just an empty bedroom. The crying child is definitely harder to place on a timeline. We do know a lot about his death, to be fair. We know that it had to have happened at a Fredbear's, and we know that while the crying child died, he was being monitored by William via the nanny cam Fredbear system. And I know, some people argue that this Fredbear is more of an imaginary friend situation, but I'm sorry. Yes, it seems that way because when FNAF 4 came out, it was meant to be a dream, but in Sister Location, we literally get a walkie-talkie next to a Fredbear next to monitors. I think it is all but incredibly likely that the Fredbears in FNAF 4 are nanny cam situations where William Afton can spy on his children. Not to mention stories like Didophobia that show us the idea of placing pre-recorded VHS tapes around. So I am almost 99% certain that the Fredbear plushes in FNAF 4 are a way for William to spy on his kids. I think it just makes sense. We also know that Michael Afton is alive during the time of Crying Child's death. I mean, he's the one that's tormenting him. Where the timeline placement gets foggy is we're not exactly sure when Fredbear's closes. After all, we know that it closes before the original Freddy's closes, but we don't have a lot of solid information on when exactly that is anyway. Not to mention, we can place the bite of the Crying crying child squarely at the end of Fredbear's, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the bite merely put the crying child into a coma and he died much later. So again, his death gets very foggy, but we can at least start to speculate the bite of the crying child. And finally, almost ironically, the death we know the least about, Charlotte Emily. I say almost ironically because we get 2 minigame recreations of this one event, which is more information than a lot of things in this franchise, but somehow both of them really don't give us a lot of context. They're very abstract. We know for a solid fact that Charlotte Emily was killed outside of a Fazbear restaurant by William Afton. We also know that the security puppet system was in place when she died, and it went out and found her, collapsing on her because of the rain, and we can speculate that this is when she possesses the puppet. We also know that when referring to it, Henry Emily says a wound first inflicted on me. But other than that, it's hard to say. Honestly, you could argue either way of this being at Freddy's or Fredbear's. After all, the only shots we get of this restaurant are in 2 very low-res minigames. The first one is incredibly low-bit, and it's just a square with Freddy in it. Now, I've seen people argue that this is Fredbear's because it's a bare-bones layout, but it literally has to be a bare-bones layout. Look at the layout of the minigame. This isn't great evidence either way. And then the other angle of a slightly higher-res minigame we get in FNAF 6 only shows the front door and that the security puppet is there. Furthermore, some people speculate that Charlotte needs to die before the missing child incident so she can be there during it and help the kids find their bodies and possess their suits. But I wouldn't argue that's even strong evidence anymore. I'll get into it a bit later, but one of the books tell us that spirits who don't know where their remains are more than capable of just being wandering spirits for any stretch of time until they find their body. The spirits could have just been chilling at Freddy's until Charlotte showed up. So no great leads either way. So what new information has come to light that has changed my mind about the order of these deaths? Well, for one, I made a whole video about Help Wanted 2's graves and how I thought at first that it was telling us the order of the missing child incident and also Charlotte Emily. I made a very firm and strong claim that the fact that the correct order of graves is missing child incident and then puppet said that the missing child incident happened first and Charlotte Emily happened after. I even went on to say that the Bonnie mask represents the crying child and the sister location elevator represents Elizabeth. So this ending was telling us that the true correct order of deaths is missing child incident, Charlotte Emily, crying child, Elizabeth Afton. And I think that is a solid theory. Since then, another interpretation of this scene has surfaced and it swayed me personally. I first saw this interpretation on FNAF's video about Help Wanted 2, and he stated that this was helping the children move on, or at least a representation of when they moved on. And admittedly, that's a great interpretation. I've mentioned before that the memory plushes you get in that game very much represent poppets, which are traditionally religion or faith-based tools to do a lot of things, but very often they are used in memory or memorial. And lighting a candle and placing a poppet of someone on their grave is like a by-the-books memorial service. So showing respects to those kids makes a lot of sense for this scene. So unfortunately, I don't think the grave order in Help Wanted 2 is incredibly relevant anymore. It might be telling us the missing child incident order, but that's not really necessarily important. So if that's not it, then what other new info could I be referring to? Well, a huge chunk of it is literally last week's theory, which if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend, because I'm not going to be going over every detail or piece of evidence in this video. I'm only going to touch on the conclusions in the interest of time. You can watch it right here. But briefly, that theory deals with the fact that I think it's likely that Circus Baby's Pizza World opened, or was slated to open, during the run of the original Freddy's location. Because I think the characters that we were going to see in Circus Baby's Pizza World were fan favorite characters that were selected to move on from Fall Fest. In that video, I also argued that the Fall Fest characters were originally felt costumes, like mascot costumes, that were turned into animatronics by most likely Henry Emily. It's entirely possible that the entire Freddy Fazbear's cast and the Circus Baby Pizza World cast came from Fall Fest mascot suits that were converted into animatronics. And if this is true, and some of you aren't going to like that I'm about to say this, it would put Henry Emily in a damn good position to be a parallel for Edwin Murray. Hear me out. In the story The Mimic, Edwin Murray is tasked by Fazbear to create animatronics based off of characters. This event and story takes place much later in the timeline that I'm referring to, but this task is very similar to what I would envision Henry Emily doing for transitioning these characters from Fall Fest material to restaurant material. And this robotics position makes a lot of sense for Henry Emily's character. After all, in the Silver Eyes, Henry Emily was always the mastermind of animatronics. William Afton was obsessed with how good he was at this and practically studied harder to be better than him in any way he could. Henry Emily was the genius. Part of the reason I think this is the case is what Henry says in FNAF 6. One of the lines in the Insanity ending never stuck with me quite right.
Small souls trapped in prisons of my making, now set to new purpose, and used in ways I never thought imaginable.
The standard understanding of this line is Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, and Foxy. After all, those were definitely created by Henry Emily. Well, I say definitely, probably created by Henry Emily, and the souls are imprisoned inside of them. But there's one issue with that. Now set to new purpose and used in ways I never thought imaginable. What does that mean? The Freddy's crew, to my knowledge, were not set to new purposes and used in ways never thought imaginable. You could argue that melting them down as fuel for remnant experiments is using them in a way never thought imaginable. But I wouldn't argue that that's setting them to a new purpose. What if in that moment, he's talking about the Funtime animatronics? After all, if Henry created the Funtime animatronics, and then William modified them to be able to kidnap children, that would literally be prisons of Henry's making, set to new purpose and used in ways never thought imaginable. But if that's true, and the Funtimes were characters from Fall Fest that got their own restaurant, or almost got their own restaurant, then Circus Baby's Pizza World would have had to have opened way earlier in the timeline than were thought possible, possibly even while Freddy Fazbear's Pizza was still open. Now, I hear you. What about Sister Location's hand unit? We do get this line.
Due to the massive success, and even more so the unfortunate closing of Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, it was clear that the stage was set, no pun intended, for another contender in children's entertainment. Unlike most entertainment venues, our robotic entertainers are rented out for private parties during the day.
So wouldn't that mean that Circus Baby's Pizza World had to have opened after a Freddy's location closed? Most likely the original Freddy's. I say not so. The second half of that statement is that, unlike most entertainment venues, these robots are rented out. In this instance, I think he's talking about Circus Baby's Party and Rental, which makes a lot of sense. Furthermore, Circus Baby's Pizza World never opened, so this whole phrase, when taken at face value, sounds more like Circus Baby's Party and Rental opened after Freddy Fazbear's Pizza closed. After all, he wouldn't say that our restaurant opened up if it never did. Well, he stuck around for like a half-hour recording, so that's fair. So the game's sister location would still take place much later in the timeline, but Circus Baby's Pizza World would have been slated to open near the beginning, possibly even before the missing child incident, which then begs the question, why the hell was William creating the Funtime animatronics that early in the timeline? But honestly, I have no idea. And finally, for new information, Alone Together. I touched on it earlier, but it's a story from Tales from the Pizzaplex that gives us more information on how ghosts work in this universe. It deals with a boy who doesn't realize he's dead, and he eventually finds his own body and gets all of the memories back. And up until then, he'd just been living his life as normal, not sure why most people ignore him. In this story, we learn two major things. One, when a spirit haunts somebody, they can affect their dreams. And two, until a body of someone is found, said spirit doesn't have their memories, at least not all of them, and possibly just wander around the place they've died until otherwise disturbed. Only upon finding their remains do they get all of their memories back and can possibly then find peace. So with all of this information in our pocket, what order makes the most sense? Well, there's one thing that I've never really had an explanation for, because I didn't really think I had to explain it. Why was William watching his children so carefully with those Fredbear cameras? You could argue he was just doing this because he was too busy working on Freddy's and couldn't watch his kids, so this was his way of doing both at the same time. And that's a fair reason, but it seems pretty excessive. Well, it wouldn't seem excessive if Elizabeth Afton had already died. After all, Elizabeth Afton died specifically because William wasn't watching her. It was his negligence that led to her death. So in William's mind, a fairly logical step after that happened is to ensure he would never not be watching his children ever again. And if this really is the case, then maybe we can take Elizabeth's empty room into account. That FNAF 4 empty bedroom might actually be referring to the fact that Elizabeth is already dead. Maybe it's not a throwaway red herring, but instead an intended clue. It's the mess that was left behind because of William's negligence. Not to mention, in the Silver Eyes, Mangle is a form of Funtime Foxy, not Toy Foxy, as I think he should be. But if the Mangle truly is Funtime Foxy, then in Elizabeth Afton's room is a Funtime animatronic. And even more, if Circus Baby's Pizza World was slated to be opened during the run of the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, then it could have possibly opened during the original run of Fredbear's as well, or at least the original planning to open. And furthermore, if this really happened first, then that could have been what the crying child saw. One of the very confusing lines in FNAF 4 that the Fredbear plushes used to steer the crying child away from the animatronics is "remember what you saw, don't let them catch you." That could be William using Elizabeth Afton's death to scare the crying child away from the animatronics. Granted, Circus Baby's programming dictates that she would only attack someone if no one else was in the room. But her attack isn't one frame. It takes a couple seconds, I'm sure. And maybe the crying child stepped in as it was happening, or possibly saw it from another room or through a closet he was hiding in. But if all this is true, and Elizabeth's death is the first in the timeline that causes William to create the Fredbear nanny cams and terrifies the crying child of all animatronics, does that mean that Elizabeth Afton dies first? Because up until now, I was convinced she died last. Now, there are some potential issues with this. One, why the hell did William Afton build the Funtime animatronics without any prior reason? Like, I'm not saying the missing child incident or seeing kids die is a good reason to build kidnapping robots, but there's gotta be some weird messed up logic in William's mind. And honestly, I have no idea. That is a major flaw with this theory. I cannot explain the creation of the Funtimes if Elizabeth's death is first, but maybe we'll learn more about this with Into the Pit, or possibly if we're ever gonna get a Fall Fest game, but until then, it's just kind of a, I don't know. And furthermore, what about Henry's line? A wound first inflicted on me. Now, I mention it because I'm sure someone would comment if I didn't, but I don't think that's relevant here, because I think the only two deaths of these events that can be considered wounds inflicted would be Charlotte Emily's death and the missing child incident, because those were active murders, whereas Elizabeth Afton and the crying child ostensibly were accidents. You could argue that Elizabeth Afton was a murder, but it was an accidental murder at least. So if Elizabeth Afton really is first in the timeline, then who's next? Well, like I mentioned, the crying child is hard to place on a timeline. We know it definitely had to happen while Fredbear's is open, and we know that Fredbear's has to close before Freddy Fazbear's. And I say we know that, but it's speculation mainly built off of the way the FNAF 2 phone guy talks about Fredbear's. The FNAF 2 location, by all guesses we can make, is just called Freddy Fazbear's Pizza, and it's reopening Freddy Fazbear's after some time had passed. They talk of the old Freddy Fazbear's somewhat casually, but Fredbear's is treated as this ancient restaurant they're not really even sure existed. It's an exaggeration, but he says something along the lines of, the original owner of a place, I think it was called Fredbear's Family Diner. Like, it's a weird thing to him. And we're pretty certain that the missing child incident happened in 1985, and Freddy's closed a year or so afterwards. So they would know Freddy's, it closed literally like a year or so before FNAF 2, which makes me think that Fredbear's would have had to close a few years before then, possibly in 1984. So far in this theory, if Elizabeth Afton dies first, and the crying child most likely dies before the missing child incident, then it would be Elizabeth Afton, crying child, Charlotte, Emily, missing child incident. Now, why do I say that the crying child dies before Charlotte Emily? That's more of a motive reason, so put a pin in that for now, and we'll move on to Charlotte Emily. The important thing to note with Charlotte Emily is that the security puppet system is in place when she dies. A security puppet system that cannot be in place for the missing child incident to work. If that puppet system was in place, William most likely would have gotten caught. The question then becomes, why was the security puppet system in place? Elizabeth Afton's death was possibly known to Henry Emily, but definitely not known to the public. Circus Baby's Pizza World never opened. However, the crying child's death was incredibly public in front of a crowd of people. In order to win over the public after such a public death death like that, the security puppet system could have been a response to it, saying like, hey, this was a horrible tragedy, and this is how we ensure it never happens again. It might have even been an attempt to keep Fredbear's open after the crying child was bit. But then, after Elizabeth Afton and the crying child die by animatronics created by Henry Emily, that would give William Afton plenty of motive to try to make Henry Emily pay, which is why I think that Charlotte Emily takes place after the crying child. Like, it's not really a logical explanation. I understand that it could be any which way. We're talking about a mass child serial killer here. You don't technically need solid internal logic for William Afton. He's kind of crazy, but I think it makes for a stronger argument if you have a really solid motive. And finally, after William kills Charlotte Emily and the security puppet system is done away with, now Freddy Fazbear's Pizza's right there, ripe for the missing child incident to happen, which is the last thing that I think happens in this order of events. Maybe after the sister location animatronics proved to be too volatile for William to control, he took matters into his own hands. Or maybe he was just on a killing spree after Charlotte. It's hard to tell, honestly. We don't get a lot of characterization of these characters in the games. But that MCI is what eventually shuts down the original Freddy Fazbear's Pizza. This theory, while I really like it, isn't without its issues. For one, in FNAF 4, there is those rumors that people go missing at night at Freddy's locations, which would seem to imply the missing child incident already happened. It's hard to tell. I feel like that's one of those evidence pieces that you can use as supporting evidence, but I mean, rumors like that get started anyway. And that sounds like a cop-out answer because it kind of is. Regardless, that's one of the issues. Another major issue, this is probably the biggest one with this theory, if the order truly is Elizabeth, crying child, Charlotte Emily, missing child incident, when does sister location happen? On one hand, you could argue that it happens before FNAF 2, and that Follow Me is what eventually becomes the withered animatronics. We get the first 4 nights of Follow Me, where William takes those pieces of the original animatronics and melts them down into Remnant, puts them in the sister location animatronics, goes back for the Spring Bonnie suit, and then dies. And then he gets locked up in a back room, and the withereds get transported to the FNAF 2 location. But that can't work, because William Afton has to be alive in FNAF 2. Follow Me cannot happen before FNAF 2. Somebody puts on a yellow rabbit suit from the back, and the dead child incident happens where there's 5 kids killed again. So like, that's gotta be William Afton. So if Follow Me definitely happens after FNAF 2, then sister location could theoretically happen anytime after Follow Me, but before FNAF 3. However, if sister location happens after FNAF 2, then would Michael be alive during FNAF 2? And if he was alive during then, was he alive during FNAF 1 as well? Honestly, this could spiral into an entire new separate theory, so I think we're going to do that. Plus, we're already over 3,000 words in this script, and I'm still getting over COVID, so my throat is starting to really hurt. So I think, for now, the order of these early deaths might be Elizabeth Afton, crying child, Charlotte Emily, missing child incident. Maybe. I'm still on the fence about this, because honestly, it could go a lot of ways. But I think this is officially the first video in a sort of pseudo-series I'll be doing, trying to make my own Five Nights at Freddy's timeline, and I'll be taking you guys along with me for the process. At the end of it, I'll make a video that's purely just the timeline, and then link to this playlist if you want my thought process and evidence. Should I wait until after Into the Pit, because that game is probably going to give us a lot of information, especially around the missing child incident? Yes, but I'm nothing if not cocky, and I bet I can make a pretty damn good timeline without it. And then if the game comes out and proves it like completely wrong, then I have stuff to talk about for the rest of the year. In the meantime, like I said, if you haven't seen last week's theory, a lot of today's theory relies upon it. So I really recommend you go check it out on how Balloon Boy could have been part of Circus Baby's Pizza World. It's weird, I know, but trust me. If you want your fan art featured on the channel, make sure you share it with #RyTart so I can find it. A huge shout out to the best channel members, the Dough Risers. Until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.